Tai Soon Burgess is the first ever choreographer-in-residence for the Smithsonian. He directs Washington, D.C.'s premier dance company, Tai Soon Burgess Dance Company, now in its 29th season. The Washington Post has their Pulitzer-prize winning dance critic Sarah Kaufman has said of Burgess, the artist is not only a Washington prize, but a national dance treasure. And he's the poet laureate of Washington dance. His artistic focus explores the idea of cultural confluence, and many of Burgess's dances focus on the hyphenated person, someone who is of mixed ethnic or cultural heritage, as well as issues of belonging and societal acceptance. Burgess was named the Smithsonian's first choreographer-in-residence in 2016, a residency that continues through 2023. And for over 2 decades, he has served as a cultural ambassador for the U.S. State Department, an appointment he uses to promote international cultural dialogue through the global language of dance. He hosts the Slant Podcast, available on all platforms. Dana, it's a delight to have you here.
Thank you so much, Lee. And I just must say, it's so wonderful to know you for so many years and in so many different incarnations, because many of you might not know that Lee is actually also an incredible dancer and had a wonderful dance career, and that's how we know each other, and we go back many years. So thank you so much for allowing me to be with you here today. My presentation is really a story about the confluence of art and science, and it is quite a journey that went into creating a dance inspired by America's race to the moon. And the dance is called We Choose to Go to the Moon, and it premiered in 2015 at the Kennedy Center and has since toured to many locations. But the story actually begins, here it is, with, it's true, with Elroy from the Jetsons. So the Jetsons actually premiered in 1962 and ran through into 1963. And when I was a child growing up in the early 70s, I loved the Jetsons. And what's fascinating about the Jetsons is that it parallels our understanding of how the space race infiltrated our popular culture as well. Because in 1962 at Rice University, of course, the famous address to Rice by President Kennedy was entitled, We Choose to Go to the Moon. And that became a focal point of the dance that I created. And I'll be showing you some segments of it, because the same year that I happened to be traveling with with Elroy, I was on a plane going to my hometown of Santa Fe, New Mexico, to visit my parents. And there was an empty seat next to me. And so my partner and I like to joke around and take Elroy everywhere. And so we buckled in Elroy into the empty seat. And right before the doors closed, unfortunately, or actually fortunately, one individual got on right as they were closing the door, who happened to have Elroy's seat. So I was very embarrassed, and she said, "Oh, I see that Elroy is in my seat." And I said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry." I unbuckled him. And then she sat down and she said, "Oh, I think I have something for Elroy." And she reached into her purse and pulled out a NASA patch, and she placed it in his hands. And I thought, well, that's unusual that you would have a NASA patch. So she introduced herself, and her name was Barbara Zalon. And Barbara Zalon is actually the communications and community outreach specialist for NASA at the time, and is now in charge of communications for the Artemis project. So we spoke on this flight about the intersection of art and of science, and how creativity is at the crux of exploration and innovation. And so it was very interesting. And so at the end of the flight, she gave me her card, and it just really, the conversation very much resonated with me. And I went, to Santa Fe, and I always kept that card. Well, later in the year, on another trip to Santa Fe, I was faced with a situation where my father, who was 90, was unfortunately passing away. And the night that he passed away, I sat outside, and in Santa Fe, of course, in the desert, there is very little light pollution. And so I stared up at the sky, and I really had this amazing sense of wonderment that what all of humanity shares is the cosmos, is the heavens, so to speak. And so I also started thinking about, for several weeks after my father's passing, about the greatest generation. This generation of individuals who had served in World War II, who had grown up in the Depression and had somehow still been able to believe in a dream of America, and the dream to get to the moon when challenged by President Kennedy to do so. And so I started on a journey, and I called Barbara Zaylon, and I said, you know, I have this idea to create a dance. I want to create a dance which allows a general public, a dance going public, an entertainment going public, to have a better understanding of the passion which space scientists have. And so we started to set up a series of interviews, and the individuals that she helped me contact, some of them, anyhow, were Bruce McCandless II, who is a former NASA astronaut. And then during the first of his 2 space shuttle missions, he made the first ever untethered free flight. And so I interviewed him with the support of Lockheed Martin. And then I started to interview other space scientists, Dr. Krisa Kuvalitu, who is a senior technologist in high energy astrophysics, and her research is in black holes, neutron stars, and gamma ray bursts. Dr. Neil Garrels, an experimental physicist who was working in gamma ray astronomy, also in gamma ray bursts and supernova. And Dr. Jim Zimbelman, a National Air and Space Museum geologist whose research interests were topical geological mapping of Mars and Venus. And then I reached out to a Native American Comanche and Santa Clara Pueblo medicine woman, because I was interested in understanding what was the relationship to the stars of the Native Americans, which I grew up with. And so she is Santa Fe based. She's a medicine woman whose father actually was an electrician for the Apollo missions. And her childhood best friend was Tamara Jernigan, who went on to be an astronaut. So these interviews became the basis of creating a sound score that then I created choreography to. So I just wanted to show you a few segments of the dance and sort of talk you through it. So this initial segment is the beginning of the dance. There's a Kennedy figure, and it is set to "We Choose to Go to the Moon," his iconic speech.
The exploration of space will go ahead. Whether we join in it or not, we mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond. Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. When stop.
So, such an amazing speech, isn't it? And amazing rallying of wonderful scientists who took on that challenge. The next section is actually the voice of Krisa, who is Kurvalitu, who is going to essentially make up this section. So here we go.
The exploration of...
Oops. I'm going to try that one more time.
I have been trained as a high-energy astrophysicist. In other words, I work in photons with very high energies, and these fall within the spectral range of gamma rays and X-rays. We are archaeologists of space. What we actually see has happened thousands, millions, billions of years ago. You observe something that probably may well not exist today. It's dead. Gamma ray bursts are the brightest explosions in space. You can have a gamma ray burst that lasts 10 milliseconds, 10 times 1,000th of a second, up to thousands of seconds, minutes. And you can detect the same phenomenon in that, or you can detect the same phenomenon in many, many minutes. At the same time, this release of energies tell us that these are catastrophic phenomena, which means whatever created them doesn't exist there anymore. They blew up the star that hosted them. But at the same time, they're heralds of life, because when stars die, they release elements in the universe, and as Carl Sagan said, we are stardust, and that stardust makes us humans later.
So one of the themes that began to emerge in speaking to all of the different scientists was this concept, which had been on my mind due to my father's passing away, which was, in an interesting way, what did scientists think about the concept of life, rebirth, death, and heaven? And so those interesting themes started showing up in all of the interviews. And I think you noticed one of those themes in the last segment as well. The next segment is of Mary Mota speaking about the belief system in the Pueblos of the stars.
My tribe is Comanche, and I'm also half Santa Clara Pueblo. At the age of 7, my father took us to Los Angeles during the Relocation Act, and he worked for NASA, and he worked on the Apollo capsules. He was an electrical engineer, and as a small child, you're walking around these scientists who are in white shirts, black ties, and you have no idea who these are, but they're talking about moon dust and the Mars stones, and you don't even realize how important these men are until you get older. The Comanche tribes consider themselves star people. The Pueblos are guided, of course, by star beings. There's a blue star being, a yellow star being, and a white star being, and a red star being. And the place where the Comanches go and finish their time here on this earth is a place that is a blue star. And the blue star, again, is the place where our original life being came from. It's called Sirius.
And the final segment I'd like to play for you is an interview that continues on with Mary Mota, but then finishes with Bruce McCandless, who has such a poetic way of speaking about space, and also I found to be such a humble and heroic individual as well.
We would often talk as children about what we were going to be like when we were growing up, and we'd lay on the grass, and she would talk about going into, that she was going to be an astronaut and be the first woman into space. And she turned out to be the second woman into space, which is still great. And she would ask me what I thought, and I says, well, when you go into space, you're going to see all these angels in heaven, and you're going to be one of the first ones to witness these entities. And she wasn't raised to believe in angels, but I was. So when she returned from outer space, she found out where I was and made this phone call, and I'm on the line with her, and she says, I just have to tell you that when I looked out the window, I saw this beautiful woman looking back at me, and I knew what it was. It was an angel, and I was afraid at first, but then this light overcame me, and this feeling of calmness and this beautiful warmth and comfort overcame me, and she put her finger out to me.
I joined NASA's program in the spring of '66. I don't believe in a physical location for heaven. That is, you can't go to an altitude of such and such and turn right and thrust for 10 minutes and there you are. I don't believe in that, but I do believe in a spiritual heaven and a spiritual existence. And space flight does tend to make you more deeply and more intimately experience or feel the existence of a divine being and his influence, his presence in one's life. And I also appreciated the beauty of the Earth as seen from space, and I mentioned the fact that with a pair of binoculars or something, you can really get quite a bit of detail. It's a feeling that if I can obscure the entire Earth by holding up a thumb at arm's length, and I can blot out the Earth with my thumb, there's nothing else around that's habitable here I am, 232,000 miles away from the Earth. You feel very vulnerable. You feel very, very dependent. And you also develop this sense of global, meaning the Earth, isolation.
So during this process, when I first started out, I was very, very scared that my field is so removed from the field of science. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'll be able to find common ground in these interviews. And I was just so overwhelmed by the fact that problem solving, creativity was our common ground, but also what was such a common ground in speaking to these wonderful individuals, all of them, was the passion that they had for their work and for exploration. And also an interesting thing, which maybe all of you might feel as well, is that each of the individuals had a key moment from childhood which somehow set up this sense of wonder with the cosmos that had driven them their whole life and continues to drive them into adulthood. And I thought that was very interesting because that's something that artists share also. There are these pivotal moments. And so it makes me very happy when we perform this work, especially for young people, because I think it allows them to understand the passion involved within science exploration, and also that they too can have pivotal moments that'll shape their lives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana, for sharing
Sure.
those videos and your thoughts behind them. The artistic process is an exploration. And when we talked earlier about art and sport and space, you and I, that reluctance to predict what would happen in an artistic process really came through, not just with you, but with other artists that I spoke with as well. And that ability to immerse yourself in the moment and accept the inputs that are coming in and process those into a creation is just fascinating. There's a comment on the chat here that says we have a space scientist with a dance and theater background, and he pointed us to a website called Dance Your PhD, where people can choreograph.
Yes, yes.
Isn't that
It's
wonderful?
fabulous. I love that. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, I'm going to jump ahead to a question that I just came up with here in a minute. The overview effect is a book written by Frank White, who spoke yesterday about the experience of looking back on the earth that Bruce McCandless II described there. And he talks about when there's a generation of people who have never been to Earth in space. And it made me think of your work on hyphenated peoples, right? Migrators, immigrators, emigrators, and the changes there. Can you maybe think a little bit and share your initial thoughts about what a piece might look like if you were to work with those people who are human and from Earth, but maybe have this new identity?
Well, I think that there are sort of a limited number of universal stories that affect all of humanity. And there's stories of love, there's stories of loss, there's stories of triumph. But one of the main stories that I see as recurring is the search for home, a search for a sense of place to belong. And I think that will be a fundamental psychological question, as well as a physical question, because we interact physically and are changed by that interaction with our environment. So, one of the questions that always comes to my mind is what happens in gravity-free, environments when you have access to that more, or what happens when the terrain itself is completely different, right? And those really change the way that our musculature functions and actually molds itself. And you can see that within generations that grew up on a cell phone with TikTok and Instagram. There's a different sense of perspective that's occurring. And so one of my hopes is that perspective will expand back out again, not through the filter of necessarily a device, but actually through physical interaction again and decision making that isn't predetermined through algorithms of some kind.
Yeah, fascinating perspective on that. Talk a little bit about the response of the dancers to the material. You talk about the universality of the search for home and for meaning. Were they particularly inspired in this case? Did they respond differently at all to this than from some of your other pieces?
The interesting thing about dancers is that what we learn is discipline, very much so. You have to show up to the studio at a specific time every morning in order to take class, in order to stay in shape, etc. And within that discipline can be, unfortunately, a sense of myopic vision, right? Because here many dancers grow up in front of a mirror. They're in enclosed spaces, sort of like birds in a cage. And every opportunity that we have to interact with a larger concept outside of the studio is very life-changing for the dancers, because the sciences were not any of their studies in college or in high school. And so to have a better sense of how other individuals are viewing the universe was very eye-opening. And also, I think you mentioned it earlier, this shift of consciousness that Bruce McCandless talks about when he is viewing the Earth from space, I think was probably the most moving thing for all of us, to hear him talk about the fragility of the Earth itself.
Yeah, that vulnerability that he described just really came through in the choreography, I thought. Yeah, really interesting. I want to shift gears just a little bit to your long history as the cultural ambassador for the Bureau of Economic and Cultural Affairs. Just introduce us to what that is, and then talk a little bit about some of your experiences.
Sure. For the last, 30 years now, I've been on many different tours and cultural programs, which allow me to interact with individuals from different countries around the world. And essentially, the arts are sort of soft diplomacy, they're friendship making. And I think that at the core of diplomacy in general is friendship. And the question is how to sustain and maintain and find commonality within conversation. And I think the arts are a wonderful way to do that because, for example, dance, it's a fundamental language. All cultures have danced prior to having a written language or even a spoken language. Dance has encapsulated and celebrated very key moments for humanity, right? Whether that's a dance about a harvest dance, or whether the dance has a sense of showing celebration of a community, like engaging individuals within the tribe, showing intergenerational connection through movement. So I think it is a perfect way to engage in diplomacy around the world.
Have you encountered any alternative scenarios where there's really been a difficult exchange of normal diplomacy, and it's really been an uphill battle to find a way to make dance make a difference?
I think that when those moments occur, and sometimes they occur within academia, for instance,
Yeah.
what happens in academia is that there are often schools of the arts and sciences. And yet what happens within that is there's a lack of understanding that the dance studio is a laboratory, that we're going through an experimental process, and that the outcome of that research is performative to a general public. So there seems to be within academia often a skewed fear of the body itself. And what I find fascinating about that is that the fear of the body is often at the core of, for example, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with now in terms of systemic racism within institutions themselves. And so the more that we can align with our bodies, and that doesn't mean that everybody needs to be a triathlete or everyone needs to be a dancer, but just the recognition that we are physical beings. I think it's really important.
Yeah, that's fascinating after hearing your discussion of focus on a device and sort of filtering your life experience through a device, changing your outlook there.
Mhm. Yeah.
You talked about how dance can be used to celebrate, um, you know, national accomplishments or global accomplishments.
Mhm.
Um, Given your background, can you talk a little bit about how different parts of the world utilize that advantage?
Sure. I think that there is a long history of dance being utilized within general PR campaigns for countries for propaganda usage. We can see that within the Olympics, for instance, where you see these large sort of symphonic choreographies, right? Which become sort of cavalcades of a country's power, of a country's enlightenment, right? To embrace the arts. So dance is highly important in that way. And I think that that's another thing that space exploration and scientists and dance share, is that at different moments in time, countries honor those two things, or they don't honor those two things. They don't honor the arts and they don't honor the sciences. And so when I see the sciences move forward, I also feel the arts moving forward at the same time. There seems to be something that moves them in tandem together at moments when society and socio-political structures are engaged and forward thinking.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you've observed that. I watch markets and industries, and sometimes I see things falling in step, like what you've described, but I hadn't noticed or conceived of it in that pairing. It's fascinating. Um, Even though you had a childhood interest in space, your experience with Barbara getting on the plane and with Elroy, um, you how much did you learn about just the process of going to space and in an adult's shoes, stepping back into that learning process? What was that like for you?
Um, it was very humbling, and I very much enjoyed this process because I was able to meet different scientists in different locations. And that was fascinating as well, because some scientists I met at the Air and Space Museum, for instance, and others at Goddard. and to see where astronauts trained, how they trained, what the new projects were that were in development. That was amazing as well. And the fact that everything came down to this very generous planning process. And when I say this, it's that all of the scientists thinking about, well, what would life be on Mars, or how do we bring attention back to the moon, for instance, and revisit the moon. These are all projects that people were talking about in a very selfless way, and also in a way that was decades sometimes down the line, where I was thinking this individual knows that they're not going to be necessarily alive to celebrate the fruition of a lifetime of work. And yet they feel very much that their work is important because it's part of a continuum. And that for me was fascinating.
Yeah, I think both dance and science have a history of standing on the accomplishments of the people who came before.
Definitely.
And yeah, and those who are particularly well educated about that background can make more headway. And so the people that you spoke with, as well as you on the art side, were able to move things forward by leveraging what came before, and that will help those who come after. And I have noticed that in space people, as I get to know the industry and the community, there's this sort of civilization-based momentum that they feel, that we feel, and it's something that scientists certainly deal with. And you don't know that you're going to live to see the fruit of your accomplishments come to pass, but you still work at it every
Right.
day.
It's just so generous, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Go back just a little bit. You made a comment about the dance studio being a laboratory. Talk about some failed experiments in the laboratory. What didn't go right? What didn't work?
Yeah.
So for those who aren't as familiar with the studio as we are.
Well, I think what's changed in my lifespan as a choreographer is that as a young choreographer, I was much more control centric in what I thought I was going to bring to the studio, in terms of I'm going to bring exacting choreography, that I'm going to know every single movement on every single count of the music, and I'm just going to teach it to these dancers, and then I'm going to walk out the door. But as I have gotten more experience and more mature as a choreographer, what I find is the best thing to do is to experiment in the studio, meaning that there are certain improvisational structures that I'll give the dancers to work with one another, to work a duet out. I'll show them movement and then do it very, very quickly, and then ask them to respond to it, for instance. So I'm getting this sort of response, and then I'll often break them up into almost a control group and an experimental and another group, so one's doing an original phrase, one is experimenting off the original phrase. So the dance studio really becomes a laboratory of movement experimentation, and my job then becomes to create enough experimental structures that then I can curate innovative and interesting work that'll bring about the right movement message. So, and I think that parallels scientists, right? That you can't go into a study expecting a certain result and being too blocked or rigid. It's like there's always this leap of faith that we have to jump into the abyss and say, let's see what's on the other side of this. And that's the creative venturing.
Yeah, and I think that's a key to what people misunderstand about science as well, is that you're taking that same leap of faith. You're approaching with humility, the that you don't know what the result of your experiment is going to be. You don't know that your hypothesis is correct, and you undertake that with the humility that you described. Really, really a lovely connection there. I got a private chat here that says that space people are cathedral builders,
Oh,
and
I love that.
that's also an allusion to the book, The Overview Effect, where you know, he compares space projects to large public works, but inspirational projects like cathedrals in the past, where you may not, you'll add your brick, and then move on with your life and pass away, and your children's children will finish the flying buttresses for all to enjoy.
The
So really,
beautiful
really.
image.
Let me see. So you thought of, because of your background, you thought of bringing in these other viewpoints into your choreography. So the medicine woman's perspective, the child among adult scientists' perspective, just a really fascinating mix. What made you decide to incorporate those, and what surprised you about that input that you received?
Well, I didn't know that Mary Mota, the medicine woman, I did not know her best childhood friend was an astronaut. I had heard through the grapevine that she had some kind of connection to the early Apollo time period because her father was an electrician, but that was all I knew. So as the stories unfolded, and each individual, these are just tiny snippets of their interviews, but each interview did unfold and reveal some sort of serendipity, and then some kind of confluence of happenings that then led to the unfolding of their lives. And what I thought was interesting is that all of them were cognizant of those moments. And sometimes when I speak to individuals, and I kind of am, curious, like, what was that, watershed moment that you have? What was that moment of inspiration as a child that you can remember? And it's fascinating how many people cannot name it.
Yeah.
And so, but all of these individuals who are so highly successful in their field could name it exactly. There were moments where one of the scientists mentioned being out in the desert for the first time without light pollution because his father had taken him out to look through a telescope, and that changed his life when he was 8 years old. And so it's those moments that I think are, we need to find more ways for young people to have those moments and to remember and experience them.
Yeah, and I think they can happen in adulthood as well.
Good
I had
point.
two prior speakers, one of whom was in military service. And one of the painful drills that they had to go through was standing on a platform all night long. And it was in a place in the world without light pollution. And he already had this, career, and was working in the military. And now he is an astronautical engineer, and doing all kinds of work in the space industry. And just, yes, the getting people to places where there's no light pollution will
Mhm.
change the experience in a way. Um,
Completely. Yeah. And I think also that in our daily lives, because the world has sped up technologically in such a fashion, the question I often ask people is, are there moments in your life that you set aside in order to take time to almost resonate on nothing? And what I mean by that is, in those moments, I think come clarity through the subconscious of problem solving. And it's like, unless we build those in and we cherish and honor those things, I think it's difficult to have those leaps of faith.
That's a great point. I think there's a lot of literature in the news through the pandemic about changing perspectives, people moving. I mean, the real estate market is just going crazy because I think people are seeking that in this disruption to their lives. They're finding an avenue where there's actually a silver lining, and it takes the shape of what you just described. When you talk about people's experience and the perspective of the phone and the device and looking at the sky, talk about whether the cultural exchanges you're involved with have gotten more difficult or are really the same over time as a result.
That's really interesting because I think where the cultural exchanges have been, and this is not necessarily at this moment or recent ones, but just is a theme that I've noticed over the decades, the difficulty in societies that are not honoring human rights, women's rights, gay rights, in general, when a society is being politically locked down and suppressed, that is where it's most difficult to engage because people are scared, to be quite honest, to have open conversation.
Yeah.
Or to experience, and part of open conversation is being able to move freely with the body. And so you can really see the impact on that in individuals. I mean, it really is trauma, right?
Yeah.
And how it manifests.
And you've seen that firsthand.
Absolutely. When I was years ago in Pakistan, for instance, I met a dancer who had been actually attacked and shot for dancing and was recovering, and in other locations, the freedom of the body is not necessarily honored in a way that is in other parts of the world. And so these are, major awakening moments for me where I realize how much freedom we have in the United States, how we need to really use that freedom for experimentation as much as possible and not take it for granted.
Thank you so much, Dana. Tell us briefly about your podcast, the Slant Podcast.
Oh, sure. Thank you for asking. It's slantpodcast.com, and it's available on all platforms. So I hope you'll listen. And it's a podcast dedicated to Asian American arts luminaries. And I interview them. It's directors, film directors, writers, actors, singers, dancers. And I just felt that in the midst of the resurgence of anti-Asian violence that's been going on in America and around the world, that I wanted to do something to help people better understand the multifaceted Asian American experience. And so that's what it's designed for, but it's really a lot of fun and it's very informative. So I hope you'll check in.
Thank you so much, Dana. It's a delight to see you on screen. And
oh, it's so nice to see you.
more wonderful conversations into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.